Greetings, traveler. You've arrived at a place where time slows down, and the worries of the day begin to fade. Here, we gather to listen to history told not in haste, but in a gentle rhythm meant to calm the mind. Perhaps you're ready to drift into sleep, or perhaps you simply wish for quiet company tonight. Either way, I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time of day accompanies your journey back through the ages? And if you find these soft retellings of the past comforting, a simple tap on subscribe ensures you'll never miss another night's tale. Now, breathe deeply, rest easily, and let us step into the stories waiting just beyond the veil of memory. There are moments in the life of a nation when time itself seems to fracture, when the ordinary rhythm of days shatters into fragments of before and after. November 22nd, 1963 was such a moment for America, a day when the bright Texas sun bore witness to an event that would echo through generations, reshaping not just politics but the very soul of a people. To understand that day, we must first journey backward through the years, tracing the threads that wove together to create both the man who would become president and the country that would mourn him. The America of the early 1960s was a land of contradictions, a nation standing at the crossroads of its own becoming. On the surface, prosperity gleamed like chrome on the tail fins of Cadillacs cruising down newly paved highways. The post-war economic boom had lifted millions into a middle-class existence their parents could scarcely have imagined. Suburban development sprawled across former farmland, row upon row of ranch houses with manicured lawns, each containing a television that beamed images of an idealized American life into living rooms across the continent. Children born in the baby boom years filled schools and playgrounds with their laughter, embodying a future that seemed limitless in its promise. Yet beneath this gleaming surface, currents of change moved with gathering force. In the South, the civil rights movement was challenging centuries of racial oppression, and the old order was fighting back with violence and vitriol. Young people were beginning to question the assumptions of their elders, inspired by new music, new ideas, new visions of what society could become. The Cold War cast its shadow across everything, the specter of nuclear annihilation lurking behind every international crisis. America was a nation proud of its power yet uncertain of its direction, confident in its ideals yet struggling to live up to them. Into this moment stepped John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a man who seemed to embody both the promise and the contradictions of his time. Born in 1917 to a family of wealth and ambition, Kennedy had grown up in a world of privilege that was nevertheless shadowed by expectation and loss. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had built a fortune through business dealings that often skirted the edges of propriety, and he harbored political ambitions that he would eventually transfer to his sons when his own aspirations were thwarted. The Kennedy children were raised to compete, to excel, to win at any cost. Yet they were also taught a sense of public service, an obligation that came with their advantages. Young Jack Kennedy was not the obvious choice to carry his family's political torch. That role had belonged to his older brother Joe, golden and confident, who seemed destined for greatness until his death in a bombing mission over Europe in the final year of the Second World War. Jack himself nearly died in that war, his small patrol torpedo boat rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in the darkness of the Solomon Islands. The story of how he saved his crew, towing an injured man through miles of ocean with a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth, would become legend. But the injuries he sustained, added to the chronic back pain and other ailments that had plagued him since childhood, left him with a legacy of physical suffering he would carry for the rest of his life. After the war, Kennedy entered politics almost as if assuming a duty, winning election to Congress and then to the Senate. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost too perfect, with his thick auburn hair and easy smile, but there was also something ethereal about him, a quality that suggested he was not entirely of the rough-and-tumble world of politics. He married Jacqueline Bouvier, a woman of grace and cultivation who would become as much a part of his public image as his own charisma. Together they projected an aura of youth and sophistication that America found intoxicating. The presidential campaign of 1960 was one of the closest in American history. Kennedy faced Vice President Richard Nixon, a man of undeniable intelligence and experience who nevertheless lacked Kennedy's ease before the cameras. The famous televised debates between them revealed the power of this new medium to shape political destinies. Those who listened on the radio often thought Nixon had won with his command of policy details. But television viewers saw something different. They saw Kennedy's poise and vitality contrasted with Nixon's sweaty nervousness, and they made their choice accordingly. When the votes were counted, Kennedy had won by the narrowest of margins, less than 1% of the popular vote separating victory from defeat. The inauguration on January 20, 1961, took place on a day of bitter cold, snow falling on the capital city as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging the gravity of the moment. The aging poet Robert Frost, invited to read at the ceremony, struggled with the glare of sunlight on snow, unable to see the new poem he had written for the occasion. Instead, he recited from memory his older work, The Gift outright, its lines about a land that was ours before we were the land's, taking on new resonance. Then Kennedy rose to speak, and his words rang out across the frozen mall with a clarity that seemed to cut through the cold itself. "Let the word go forth from this time and place," he declared, to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. He spoke of bearing any burden, meeting any hardship, supporting any friend and opposing any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. And then came the words that would echo through history: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It was a call to service, to sacrifice, to a higher purpose than mere material comfort. Many who heard those words felt something stir within them, a sense that perhaps they too could be part of something larger than themselves. The Kennedy presidency that followed was marked by both triumph and crisis, by moments of inspiration and instances of profound difficulty. The Bay of Pigs invasion, an ill-conceived attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's government in Cuba, ended in disaster mere months after Kennedy took office. The new president took responsibility for the failure with a candor that actually increased his public support. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, 13 days when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war as Soviet missiles in Cuba brought the prospect of atomic annihilation terrifyingly close. Kennedy's handling of that crisis, his combination of public firmness and private diplomacy, averted catastrophe and earned him acclaim as a statesman. On the domestic front, Kennedy faced the accelerating demands of the civil rights movement with a caution that frustrated activists even as he gradually moved toward stronger support for their cause. The images coming out of the South were impossible to ignore: fire hoses and police dogs turned on peaceful protesters, children being denied entrance to schools by angry mobs, freedom riders beaten by racist thugs while local authorities looked the other way. Kennedy understood that America's moral standing in the world was compromised by its treatment of its black citizens, yet he also feared the political consequences of moving too quickly against segregation. His brother Robert, serving as Attorney General, pushed more forcefully for civil rights enforcement, but progress remained frustratingly slow for those who had waited so long for justice. The president spoke of a new frontier, invoking the image of pioneers pushing into unknown territory, but the frontier he envisioned was not geographic but social and technological. He committed America to landing a man on the moon before the decade's end, a goal that seemed almost fantastical at a time when the nation's space program had barely managed to put a few astronauts into brief orbital flights. He proposed a Peace Corps to send young Americans abroad to serve in developing nations, offering an alternative to military might as a way of engaging with the world. He spoke eloquently of the arts and culture, bringing musicians and writers to the White House and creating an atmosphere of intellectual vitality that stood in sharp contrast to the staid formality of previous administrations. Yet there was also a darker side to the Kennedy presidency, aspects that would only become clear to the public years later. The president's chronic health problems were carefully concealed, as were the medications and treatments he used to manage them. His personal life was far from the idealized image presented to the public, his marriage complicated by infidelities that were known to insiders but hidden from the broader American people by a press corps that maintained different standards about what was appropriate to report. The administration's foreign policy included covert operations and interventions that contradicted the high-minded rhetoric of its public statements. Kennedy was a complex man, neither the saint his admirers sometimes portrayed nor the cynical manipulator his detractors claimed, but rather someone struggling to navigate the impossible demands of power while carrying the weight of his family's expectations and his own physical fragility. By the autumn of 1963, Kennedy was looking ahead to the presidential campaign that would come the following year. His hold on power was far from secure. The narrow margin of his election meant he could not afford to lose support in key states, and Texas was one of those states where his position was precarious. The Democratic Party there was fractured by feuds between conservative and liberal factions, and the president's support for civil rights was alienating many white voters in the South. A trip to Texas was planned for late November, both to raise funds for the coming campaign and to try to heal the divisions within the state party. The president's advisors debated the wisdom of the trip. Texas was not friendly territory. Adlai Stevenson, the ambassador to the United Nations, had been heckled and spat upon during a recent visit to Dallas. The city had a reputation as a hotbed of right-wing extremism, where John Birch Society members distributed literature accusing Kennedy of treason and newspaper advertisements questioned his loyalty. Some worried that the president's presence would only inflame these passions. But Kennedy was not one to avoid challenge, and the political calculations seemed to outweigh the risks. The trip was scheduled to include stops in San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Austin over the course of 2 days. The presidential party arrived in San Antonio on the afternoon of November 21st. The reception was warm, with large crowds turning out to see the president and first lady. Jackie Kennedy had joined the trip, one of her rare appearances on political outings. She was still recovering from the loss of their infant son Patrick, who had died just 3 months earlier after living only 2 days. The grief of that loss lingered in her eyes, but she smiled for the crowds and performed her role with the grace that had made her such an effective ambassador for her husband's administration. That evening in Houston, the president spoke at a dinner honoring Congressman Albert Thomas. He was in good spirits, joking with the crowd and displaying the wit that had become his trademark. From Houston, the party flew to Fort Worth, arriving late and checking into the Texas hotel. Despite the hour, crowds waited in the rain outside the hotel, hoping for a glimpse of the president. Kennedy came to the window and waved, touched by their dedication. The next morning, November 22nd, dawned gray but with the promise of clearing skies. Kennedy spoke to a crowd gathered in a parking lot outside the hotel, then attended a breakfast of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. The mood was light, almost playful. At the breakfast, someone noted that Mrs. Kennedy was late in arriving, and the president quipped that it took her longer to get ready but that when she did, it was worth it. When Jackie finally entered the room, the crowd rose and applauded, and Kennedy remarked with obvious pride, "2 years ago, I introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I am getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas." After the breakfast, the presidential party prepared for the short flight to Dallas. The weather had cleared, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. This was good news because the plan called for the president to ride in an open-top limousine through the streets of Dallas so that as many people as possible could see him. The Secret Service had suggested using the bubble top that could be fitted to the presidential limousine, but it was not bulletproof, merely a protection against weather. With the sun shining, there seemed no reason to use it. The flight to Dallas took only minutes. Air Force One touched down at Love Field at 11:40 on the morning of November 22nd. A crowd of several thousand had gathered to greet the president, and they cheered as he and the First Lady descended the stairs from the aircraft. Jackie was handed a bouquet of red roses, and she carried them as they made their way along the fence line, shaking hands with well-wishers. The president, too, worked the crowd, his smile genuine as he greeted the people who had come to see him. Despite the warnings about Dallas's hostility, the reception seemed genuinely warm. At 11:50, the motorcade left the airport. The president and first lady sat in the back seat of a midnight blue Lincoln Continental convertible. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie sat in jump seats in front of them. Two Secret Service agents were in the front seat, with driver William Greer at the wheel and Agent Roy Kellerman beside him. The car was specially modified for presidential use, with running boards where agents could stand and elevated seats in the rear to make the president more visible to crowds. Behind the presidential limousine came a car carrying more Secret Service agents, and behind that, a vehicle carrying Vice President Lyndon Johnson and his wife Lady Bird. The route into downtown Dallas had been published in the newspapers days before, so the crowds knew where to gather. As the motorcade made its way through the streets, thousands of people lined the sidewalks, waving and cheering. The president was clearly pleased by the reception. At one point, Nellie Connally turned around and said to him, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy smiled and replied, "That is very obvious." The motorcade turned onto Main Street, entering the heart of downtown. Here the buildings rose on either side, their windows filled with office workers who had taken a break to watch the president pass. Confetti and torn paper floated down from the upper floors in an impromptu celebration. The crowds were thick, pressing close to the slow-moving vehicles. The president waved, his hand moving in that familiar gesture that had become so characteristic of him. Jackie, too, smiled and waved, her pink suit bright in the noonday sun. At the end of Main Street, the motorcade turned right onto Houston Street for a single block, then made a sharp left turn onto Elm Street. This turn took the vehicles past the Texas School Book Depository, a 7-story building that served as a warehouse for textbooks. As the presidential limousine made the turn onto Elm Street, it passed almost directly beneath the building's 6th-floor windows. The car was now heading down a gentle slope toward an underpass that would take the motorcade onto Stemmons Freeway for the short drive to the Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to speak at a luncheon. The time was 12:30 in the afternoon. What happened next unfolded in a span of seconds, yet those seconds would be analyzed and debated for generations, frame by frame, witness by witness, becoming perhaps the most scrutinized moments in American history. A sharp sound cracked through the air, echoing off the buildings that lined the plaza. Some in the crowd thought it was a firecracker or a car backfiring. The president's hands moved toward his throat. Governor Connally, hearing the sound, began to turn to look back over his right shoulder, and as he did, a second shot struck him, the bullet passing through his back, chest, right wrist, and lodging in his left thigh. The governor cried out, "Oh, no, no, no," and slumped in his seat. Mrs. Kennedy, seeing something was wrong but not yet understanding the full horror, turned toward her husband. His hands were still at his throat, and he was leaning slightly toward her. Then came a third shot, and this one struck the president's head with devastating effect. The impact was visible even from a distance, and it was catastrophic. Mrs. Kennedy cried out, "They've killed my husband," and in her shock and desperation, she began to climb onto the trunk of the moving limousine, perhaps trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull that had been blown away, or perhaps simply acting on some primal instinct to escape the horror. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had been riding on the running board of the follow-up car, leaped off and ran toward the presidential limousine. He managed to grab onto the back of the car and pull himself up, pushing Mrs. Kennedy back into her seat and shielding the president and first lady with his own body. Driver William Greer, who had initially slowed the car when the first shots rang out, now accelerated toward the underpass and the freeway beyond. In the moment of the shooting, perhaps 5 or 6 seconds had passed. 2 men had been gravely wounded, one mortally. And a nation's innocence, such as it was, had been shattered irrevocably. The limousine raced toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, a modern facility about 4 miles from Dealey Plaza. Governor Connolly, though seriously wounded, remained conscious. He would later remember the ride to the hospital, the sound of Mrs. Kennedy's voice repeating, "They've killed my husband, they've killed my husband," and his own wife Nellie cradling him and telling him he would be all right. The president, however, had lost consciousness immediately. He lay across his wife's lap, his blood staining her pink suit, as she cradled his head in her hands. The limousine arrived at Parkland Hospital at 12:36, just 6 minutes after the shots had been fired. Secret Service agents and hospital staff rushed the president into Trauma Room 1. Mrs. Kennedy, her clothes soaked with her husband's blood, tried to follow but was gently held back in the corridor. Inside the trauma room, doctors quickly realized the hopelessness of the situation. The head wound was massive, incompatible with life. Yet they tried everything they could, performing a tracheotomy, administering fluids and blood, even performing closed-chest cardiac massage. Father Oscar Huber, a Catholic priest from a nearby church, arrived and administered last rites. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, less than half an hour after the shooting, Dr. Kemp Clark, the neurosurgeon who had been supervising the resuscitation efforts, pronounced the president dead. His heart had continued to beat weakly for some time after he was shot, but the massive trauma to his brain meant there was never any realistic hope of survival. The official time of death was set as 1 p.m., though in truth, John F. Kennedy had died the moment the third bullet struck his head. In another trauma room, doctors were working on Governor Connolly. His wounds were serious but not fatal, and he would eventually recover fully, though he would carry fragments of the bullet in his body for the rest of his life. The governor's survival, in fact, would become part of the controversy that would later surround the assassination, as investigators tried to determine whether one bullet could have caused all of his wounds plus the president's non-fatal throat wound, or whether multiple shooters must have been involved. But at Parkland Hospital in those first stunned moments, such questions were far in the future. The immediate reality was incomprehensible shock. Nurses and doctors who had been going about their routine hospital duties found themselves at the center of an event that would be recorded in history books. Secret Service agents, trained to protect the president with their lives if necessary, now faced the devastating reality that they had failed in their mission. And Jacqueline Kennedy, who had begun the day as First Lady, was now a widow at 34 years old, her husband's blood still wet on her clothing. Mrs. Kennedy refused to change her clothes. When someone suggested she might want to clean up, she replied, "No. Let them see what they've done." It was a statement that spoke to her shock and her anger, but also to her understanding, even in that moment of overwhelming grief, of the symbolic power of her blood-stained appearance. She insisted on staying with her husband's body, and when it came time to transport the casket, she rode in the hearse to Love Field. Meanwhile, chaos and confusion reigned across the city and nation. The first bulletins reporting the shooting reached radio and television stations within minutes. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite interrupted a soap opera to report that shots had been fired at the president's motorcade. The early reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Some said the president had been wounded, others that he had been killed. Then came the official confirmation from the hospital: President Kennedy was dead. Cronkite, reading the bulletin, paused to remove his glasses and wipe his eyes, struggling to maintain his composure as he informed the nation of the unthinkable. Across America, people stopped what they were doing as word spread. In offices and factories, on college campuses and in schools, the news arrived like a physical blow. Many people's first reaction was disbelief. Surely this could not be true. Assassinations happened in other countries, in places with unstable governments and violent politics. Not in America. not in broad daylight on a city street. Not to a president who had seemed so vital, so young, so full of promise just hours before. In Dallas, police were already in motion. A witness in Dealey Plaza, Howard Brennan, had told officers he had seen a man with a rifle in a sixth-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Police entered the building and began to search it. Other officers spread out across the area, looking for anyone suspicious. Reports came in of a policeman being shot several blocks away in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. The violence of the day was not yet over. The man who shot President Kennedy was named Lee Harvey Oswald, and to understand what happened that day requires understanding something of his strange and troubled life. Born in New Orleans in 1939, Oswald grew up in poverty and emotional instability. His father died before he was born, and his mother, Marguerite, was a difficult woman, narcissistic and demanding. Young Lee moved frequently, attending numerous schools, never quite fitting in anywhere. He was intelligent but underachieving, alienated and angry. As a teenager, Oswald became interested in Marxism, reading communist literature and declaring himself a socialist. At 17, he joined the Marine Corps, perhaps seeking the structure and belonging he had never known. But the Marines did not cure his alienation. He was a mediocre serviceman, court-martialed twice for minor offenses. In 1959, at age 20, Oswald received a hardship discharge and almost immediately defected to the Soviet Union, declaring that he wanted to become a Soviet citizen. The Soviets did not quite know what to make of this young American who appeared at their embassy in Moscow. They eventually allowed him to remain, sending him to work in a radio factory in the city of Minsk. There Oswald met and married Marina Prusakova, a young woman working as a pharmacist. But Oswald's romantic vision of Soviet life soon soured. He found the reality of living under communism disappointing and petty. By 1962, he was writing to the American embassy, asking to return to the United States. Remarkably, the American government allowed this, even lending him money for the passage. Back in America, Oswald drifted from job to job, city to city. He moved to Fort Worth, then to New Orleans, then back to the Dallas area. He and Marina had 2 daughters, but the marriage was troubled, marked by Oswald's violent temper and controlling behavior. He continued his political activities, such as they were, distributing pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans and getting into a scuffle with anti-Castro Cubans. He also ordered a rifle through a mail-order catalog and allegedly attempted to shoot retired Army General Edwin Walker, a prominent right-wing figure, though he missed and fled. In October 1963, Oswald got a job at the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas. His wife and children were living with a woman named Ruth Payne in the suburb of Irving. Oswald stayed in a rooming house in Dallas during the week and visited his family on weekends. On the morning of November 22nd, he asked a coworker for a ride to Irving, saying he needed to pick up some curtain rods. He returned to work that morning carrying a long paper-wrapped package. Later investigation would determine that Oswald had brought his rifle to work that day, broken down in the package. He spent the morning working on the 6th floor of the book depository, filling orders for textbooks. As noon approached and his co-workers went downstairs for lunch, Oswald remained behind. He constructed a sniper's nest out of boxes near a window overlooking Elm Street. From that position, he had a clear view of the presidential motorcade as it passed below. After the shooting, Oswald calmly left the building. A police officer encountered him in the second-floor lunchroom about 90 seconds after the shots were fired, but the building superintendent who was with the officer told him Oswald was an employee, and the policeman let him go. Oswald walked several blocks and caught a bus, then got off and took a taxi to his rooming house. He picked up a revolver and left again on foot. About 45 minutes after the assassination, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit spotted Oswald walking along a residential street in Oak Cliff. Tippit, responding to the description of the suspect broadcast over police radio, stopped his patrol car and approached Oswald. What exactly transpired in the next moments is unclear, but Tippit ended up dead on the sidewalk, shot 4 times with Oswald's revolver. Multiple witnesses saw the shooting or its immediate aftermath. Oswald continued walking, now moving quickly. He ducked into a shoe store when he heard police sirens, then continued to the Texas Theater, a movie house showing a double feature. He entered without paying. The shoe store manager, suspicious of Oswald's behavior, called police. Officers surrounded the theater and entered. When they tried to arrest Oswald, he pulled his revolver and tried to shoot, but an officer managed to grab the gun. Oswald was wrestled into submission, arrested, and taken to Dallas Police Headquarters. The time was shortly before 2 in the afternoon, less than 2 hours after he had shot the president. Back at Love Field, preparations were underway to return the president's body to Washington. Air Force One sat on the tarmac, but the aircraft could not leave immediately. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who had been 2 cars behind the president in the motorcade and had been rushed to safety at Parkland Hospital, was now the President of the United States. But Johnson wanted to be sworn in before the plane left Dallas, to establish the continuity of government beyond any question. A search was launched for someone authorized to administer the oath of office. Federal Judge Sarah Hughes, a Johnson friend and appointee, was located and brought to the airport. She arrived at Air Force One carrying a Bible borrowed from Kennedy's desk at the Dallas Trade Mart. The swearing-in took place in the cramped cabin of the aircraft, with Johnson's hand on the Bible and his wife Lady Bird at his side. Jacqueline Kennedy, still wearing her blood-stained suit, stood next to Johnson as a witness. The oath was administered at 2:38 in the afternoon, 3 hours after her husband had been shot. A photographer captured the moment, and the image of Johnson with his hand raised, flanked by his wife and the widowed First Lady, would become one of the most iconic photographs of the era. Minutes later, Air Force One took off for Washington, carrying the new president, the grief-stricken widow, and the casket containing the body of John F. Kennedy. During the flight, Lady Bird Johnson tried to comfort Mrs. Kennedy, but there was little that could be said. The First Lady sat near her husband's casket for much of the flight, lost in her grief. Johnson, meanwhile, began making phone calls, consulting with advisors, taking up the reins of power with a heavy heart but also with the knowledge that the government could not pause in its functioning, even for tragedy. The plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington at 6 o'clock that evening. Television cameras captured the scene as the casket was removed from the aircraft, carried by a military honor guard. Mrs. Kennedy followed, and the nation watching on television saw her for the first time since the assassination, her suit still visibly stained with blood. The sight was shocking and heartbreaking. She looked small and lost, yet she maintained her composure with a dignity that would characterize her conduct throughout the terrible days to come. The casket was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where an autopsy would be performed. Mrs. Kennedy waited through the long night as doctors examined her husband's body. The autopsy, conducted under difficult conditions by pathologists who were not specialists in gunshot wounds, would later be criticized as inadequate and would fuel decades of conspiracy theories. But that night, the medical examination was simply one more ordeal to be endured. The Kennedy family began to gather in Washington. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest confidant, had been the first family member to reach Mrs. Kennedy, flying to Andrews Air Force Base and boarding Air Force One as soon as it landed. His grief was overwhelming, but he pushed it aside to support his sister-in-law and to begin making arrangements for the funeral. Other Kennedy siblings arrived through the evening. Their mother, Rose Kennedy, receiving the news at the family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, responded with the stoic faith that had sustained her through so many tragedies. Their father, Joseph Kennedy, was incapacitated by a stroke he had suffered 2 years earlier and could barely communicate, adding another layer of pathos to the family's grief. In Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald was being interrogated by police and federal agents. He denied shooting anyone, claiming he was a patsy being set up to take the blame for crimes he did not commit. He showed no remorse and seemed almost to enjoy the attention. The physical evidence, however, was damning. His rifle had been found on the 6th floor of the book depository, hidden behind some boxes. His palm print was on the rifle. Paraffin tests showed residue consistent with having recently fired a gun. Witnesses had seen him in the building and fleeing afterward. The rifle had been purchased by mail order under a name Oswald had used as an alias. His revolver was conclusively matched to the bullets that killed Officer Tippit. On Saturday, November 23rd, the day after the assassination, the nation remained in shock. Regular television programming was canceled on all networks, replaced with continuous coverage of the unfolding events. News reporters struggled to convey information that was still fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. In Washington, plans were being made for the president's funeral. Mrs. Kennedy, drawing on her knowledge of history and her sense of occasion, looked to the funeral of Abraham Lincoln as a model. She wanted her husband honored with full state ceremony, his service to the nation recognized with the dignity and grandeur it deserved. The president's body was taken from Bethesda Hospital to the White House early Saturday morning. The casket was placed in the East Room, where it rested on the same catafalque that had held Lincoln's casket nearly a century before. An honor guard stood watch. Later that day, a small private service was held for family and close friends. Then, on Sunday afternoon, the casket was moved to the Capitol, carried on a horse-drawn caisson through the streets of Washington in a solemn procession. At the Capitol, the casket was placed in the rotunda to lie in state. A brief ceremony was held, and then the doors were opened to the public. Through the night and into the next day, hundreds of thousands of people filed past the casket, waiting in lines that stretched for blocks to pay their respects to the fallen president. Many wept openly. Others stood in silent contemplation. The line moved slowly, each person allowed only a moment before the casket before being ushered along to make room for those behind. It was a collective mourning, a nation coming together in shared grief. But on Sunday morning, November 24th, the tragedy took another shocking turn. Dallas police had decided to transfer Oswald from the city jail to the county facility. Despite concerns about security, the transfer was announced in advance and was scheduled to take place in the basement of the police headquarters, where reporters and cameras could observe. It was an inexplicable decision that prioritized publicity over safety. As Oswald was being led through the basement, a man stepped forward from the crowd of reporters and fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen. The shooting was captured live on television, and millions of Americans watched in real time as the accused assassin doubled over in pain. The shooter was quickly subdued by police. He was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with connections to both the police and to organized crime figures. Ruby claimed he had shot Oswald to spare Mrs. Kennedy the ordeal of a trial. Whatever his true motive, the effect was to ensure that many questions about the assassination would never be answered. Oswald was rushed to the same hospital where President Kennedy had died, and he too died there, 2 days after killing the president. Ruby's killing of Oswald added another layer of tragedy and mystery to the events. Many people immediately suspected that Ruby had been sent to silence Oswald, to prevent him from revealing that he was part of a larger conspiracy. Investigations would later conclude that Ruby had acted alone, motivated by a confused mixture of grief and desire for attention, but the suspicions never entirely faded. The fact that the accused assassin had been murdered before he could stand trial seemed almost too convenient, too neat. It fed the sense that there were hidden forces at work, that the official story could not be the whole truth. On Monday, November 25th, John F. Kennedy was laid to rest. It was his son's third birthday, a cruel coincidence that added poignancy to an already heartbreaking day. The funeral was attended by leaders from around the world. Over 200 dignitaries came to Washington to pay their respects, including heads of state, princes and presidents, emperors and prime ministers. The procession from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the funeral mass was carried live on television, and much of the nation watched. The images from that day are seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed them. The caisson carrying the casket, drawn by 6 gray horses. The riderless horse following behind, boots reversed in the stirrups, an ancient military symbol of a fallen leader. The muffled drums maintaining a slow, steady beat. Jacqueline Kennedy, dressed in black, a veil covering her face, walking with dignity behind her husband's casket. Her brothers-in-law, Robert and Edward Kennedy, on either side of her. World leaders following on foot in a display of respect rarely seen. At the cathedral, the funeral mass was conducted with Roman Catholic ritual. Cardinal Richard Cushing of Boston, who had married the Kennedys and baptized their children, presided. He spoke of the fallen president in personal terms, his voice breaking with emotion. During the service, the cathedral bells tolled, their sound echoing through the streets of Washington. And at the end of the service, as the casket was carried out of the church, young John Kennedy Jr., not quite 3 years old, stepped forward and saluted his father's casket, prompted by his mother. The image of the small boy saluting would become perhaps the most emotionally powerful photograph of the entire funeral. From the cathedral, the procession continued to Arlington National Cemetery, across the Potomac River in Virginia. Kennedy had visited the cemetery just weeks before and had remarked on the beauty of the view. Now he would be buried there, on a hillside overlooking the city he had led. At the graveside, the final ceremonies were brief. A military honor guard performed the folding of the flag from the casket, and it was presented to Mrs. Kennedy. 50 fighter jets flew overhead in formation, one breaking away in the missing man formation. Air Force One flew past in a final salute. Taps was played, the mournful notes floating across the quiet hillside. And then Mrs. Kennedy, with the help of Robert Kennedy, lit an eternal flame at the head of the grave. It was her idea, this flame that would burn perpetually, a symbol of a life cut short but not forgotten. As the flame caught and held steady against the November breeze, the mourners began to disperse, each carrying away their private grief. The nation that emerged from those 4 days in November was changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The immediate shock eventually gave way to other emotions, anger, confusion, a deep sense of loss that went beyond the death of one man. Kennedy had represented something to many Americans, particularly the young. He had embodied hope and possibility, the sense that the future could be better than the past. His death seemed to many to mark the end of that hope, or at least its severe wounding. The 1960s, which had begun with such promise, would become increasingly turbulent and violent. Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated in 1968. Robert Kennedy would be assassinated that same year, just as he seemed on the verge of winning the Democratic presidential nomination. The Vietnam War would tear the country apart. The optimism of the early Kennedy years would give way to cynicism and division. And yet, there was also resilience. The government had continued to function without interruption. Lyndon Johnson had assumed the presidency and would push through major civil rights legislation that Kennedy had proposed but not lived to see enacted. The moon landing that Kennedy had called for would be achieved in 1969, with astronauts planting an American flag on the lunar surface and then returning safely to Earth. The Peace Corps continued and grew. In ways large and small, the programs and ideals Kennedy had championed lived on beyond him. The investigation into the assassination began almost immediately. President Johnson appointed a commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, to examine all aspects of the crime. The Warren Commission, as it became known, spent 10 months conducting its investigation. It interviewed hundreds of witnesses, examined thousands of documents, and reviewed all the physical evidence. In September 1964, it issued its report, concluding that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in killing President Kennedy, and that Jack Ruby had acted alone in killing Oswald. There was no evidence of a conspiracy, the commission stated, foreign or domestic. But the Warren Commission's conclusions satisfied few people. The report itself, running to nearly 900 pages with 26 volumes of supporting material, was dense and difficult to parse. Many people felt it raised as many questions as it answered. Critics pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony, to evidence that seemed to have been overlooked or dismissed, to the suspicious convenience of Oswald's murder before he could be properly interrogated. Within a few years, a significant majority of Americans believed there had been a conspiracy to kill the president, even if they could not agree on who had been behind it. The theories proliferated wildly. Some believed the Soviet Union had ordered the assassination in retaliation for American actions during the Cold War. Others blamed Cuba, either Fidel Castro seeking revenge for American attempts on his life, or anti-Castro exiles angry at Kennedy for the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and his subsequent refusal to launch another attempt to overthrow the communist regime. The Mafia was suspected, possibly angry at Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of organized crime figures. Some theorized that elements within the American government itself had been responsible, perhaps rogue CIA agents or military officers who disagreed with Kennedy's foreign policy. A few even suggested that Lyndon Johnson had been involved, seeking to become president himself. Each theory had its adherents and its evidence, often the same evidence interpreted in wildly different ways. The famous Zapruder film, a home movie shot by Dallas businessman Abraham Zapruder that captured the entire assassination sequence, was analyzed frame by researchers convinced it would reveal the truth. Some saw in it evidence of shots from multiple directions, proof of additional gunmen. Others saw only what the Warren Commission had described, a lone gunman firing from behind and above the motorcade. The film itself, with its graphic depiction of the president's death, became a kind of sacred text for assassination researchers, studied with the intensity of religious scholars examining scripture. The controversies extended even to the physical evidence. The so-called magic bullet theory, which proposed that a single bullet had passed through Kennedy's neck and then struck Governor Connally multiple times, was particularly contentious. Critics argued this was physically impossible, that the bullet's trajectory and the wounds it allegedly caused defied the laws of physics. Supporters, including ballistics experts, maintained that the theory was not only possible but the most reasonable explanation of the evidence. The debate raged for years, with neither side able to convince the other. In 1976, with public confidence in government shaken by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, the House of Representatives established a select committee on assassinations to re-examine both Kennedy's murder and that of Martin Luther King Jr. This committee used newer forensic techniques and had access to evidence not available to the Warren Commission. After 2 years of investigation, it concluded that Kennedy had probably been killed as a result of a conspiracy, though it could not determine who besides Oswald might have been involved. The committee based this conclusion largely on acoustical evidence that suggested a fourth shot had been fired from the grassy knoll, an area in Dealey Plaza in front and to the right of the president's limousine. However, this acoustical evidence was later disputed and has been largely rejected by most experts. The debate over what really happened in Dallas has never truly been resolved. Polls consistently show that most Americans believe there was a conspiracy, yet no evidence has ever emerged that conclusively proves one. The passage of time has made the truth harder, not easier, to determine. Witnesses have died, memories have faded or become contaminated by exposure to media coverage and other accounts. Documents have been declassified over the years, and while they have revealed much about the Kennedy administration and about the various investigations, they have not provided the smoking gun that conspiracy theorists hoped for. What is perhaps most telling is that the very existence of these enduring mysteries and controversies reflects something important about the assassination's impact on American culture and consciousness. The murder of President Kennedy was a trauma from which, in some ways, the nation never fully recovered. It shattered a certain kind of innocence, a belief in the basic safety and stability of American life. It introduced into the public consciousness a deep skepticism about official explanations and government honesty that persists to this day. The assassination became a dividing line in American history, a before and after that shaped how people viewed their country and their leaders. For those who lived through it, the memories remain vivid decades later. People who were old enough to remember that day can almost always recall exactly where they were when they heard the news, what they were doing, how they felt. It is a shared national memory, one of the few events that truly united the country in a common experience, even if that experience was one of grief and shock. The assassination joins a small number of other events, Pearl Harbor and September 11th among them, that have this quality of universal remembrance. In the years following the assassination, Jacqueline Kennedy became a figure of almost mythic stature. Her dignity during the funeral, her strength in the face of unimaginable loss, inspired admiration around the world. She became a symbol of grace under pressure, of courage in adversity. In a magazine interview shortly after the assassination, she spoke of her husband's love of the musical Camelot, and she suggested that his presidency had been like that mythical kingdom, a brief shining moment that was now gone. The comparison was apt, even if somewhat romanticized. Kennedy's administration, like Arthur's Camelot, had been a time of idealism and hope that ended in tragedy. Mrs. Kennedy eventually remarried, becoming Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis when she wed Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis in 1968. The marriage surprised many and disappointed those who had placed her on a pedestal, but it was perhaps a necessary step in her own healing and moving forward. After Onassis's death in 1975, she returned to New York and worked as a book editor, living a quieter life away from the spotlight. She raised her two children, Caroline and John Jr., with fierce protectiveness, trying to give them as normal a life as possible given their circumstances. She rarely spoke publicly about the assassination, guarding her private grief and refusing to capitalize on her tragedy. Robert Kennedy, who had been devastated by his brother's death, threw himself into public service as a way of coping with his loss. He continued as Attorney General under President Johnson for several months, then resigned and successfully ran for the Senate from New York. He became an increasingly vocal critic of the Vietnam War and a champion of civil rights and social justice. By 1968, he had emerged as a leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, running on a platform that combined his brother's idealism with a more realistic and urgent approach to the nation's problems. His campaign rallied young people and minorities, offering hope that the promise of his brother's presidency might yet be fulfilled. But on June 5, 1968, just after winning the California primary, Robert Kennedy was shot by an assassin in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the next day, age 42, leaving behind a wife and 11 children. The parallels to his brother's death were inescapable and agonizing. The Kennedy family, already acquainted with tragedy, now had to endure another public murder, another funeral, another grave at Arlington. And the nation, which had hoped that perhaps Robert Kennedy could heal some of the divisions and renew some of the optimism of the early 60s, was left to wonder if violence had become the inevitable fate of those who sought to lead. Edward Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers, carried the family's political legacy forward, serving in the Senate for nearly half a century. But his own presidential ambitions were derailed by personal scandal and by the weight of expectation that came with his name. The Kennedy mystique, built on the achievements and tragedies of his older brothers, became in some ways a burden he could never quite escape. Still, he became one of the most effective legislators of his generation, championing health care and education and civil rights long after the idealism of the 60s had faded. The physical space where the assassination occurred became a kind of pilgrimage site, though an uncomfortable one for the city of Dallas. Dealey Plaza was left largely unchanged, and visitors came to stand on the street where the president's limousine had passed, to look up at the sixth-floor window of the book depository, to walk to the spot where Abraham Zapruder had stood with his camera. The Texas School Book Depository itself eventually became the sixth-floor museum, dedicated to examining Kennedy's life and death. The museum presents the Warren Commission's findings but also acknowledges the controversies and alternative theories, allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions. There is something both morbid and understandable about the continued fascination with the assassination. The morbid aspect is obvious, the appeal that violent death has always held for human imagination, the dark curiosity about how someone can be alive one moment and dead the next, especially someone as vital and visible as a president. But there is also something deeper, a search for meaning in what seems meaningless, an attempt to make sense of how one man with a rifle could alter the course of history. If it was simply random, simply Oswald acting alone for his own obscure reasons, then it suggests a frightening randomness to existence, a lack of control that most people find deeply unsettling. A conspiracy, as terrible as that would be, at least suggests a kind of order, a plan, something comprehensible even if evil. Kennedy's legacy has been debated and reassessed repeatedly over the decades since his death. Historians have had access to materials not available to his contemporaries, including documents revealing his health problems, his personal indiscretions, and the sometimes questionable tactics of his administration. The man who seemed almost perfect in death has been revealed in fuller, more human dimensions. His legislative achievements, while significant, were more limited than the grand rhetoric of the New Frontier suggested. His handling of foreign policy, while successful in averting nuclear war, also included actions like the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam that would have terrible consequences. Yet even with this more nuanced and critical assessment, Kennedy remains a figure of fascination and, for many, inspiration. His call to service resonated with a generation and continues to resonate with those who look back at his presidency. His eloquence and vision, his ability to articulate hopes and ideals in language that lifted people beyond their everyday concerns, set a standard that few other politicians have matched. The fact that he did not live to see most of his proposed programs enacted perhaps allows him to remain associated with the vision rather than with the messy compromises of implementation. There is also the simple human reality of a life cut short, potential unfulfilled, a future that can only be imagined. Kennedy was just 46 years old when he died. Had he lived, he might have served a second term, might have seen the country through the turbulent rest of the 60s, might have shaped events in ways we can only speculate about. Or he might have failed, might have proven inadequate to the challenges, might have left office disappointed and diminished. We will never know, and that unknowing is part of what keeps his memory alive. He is frozen at that moment of promise, forever young, forever representing what might have been. The immediate Kennedy family has largely passed now. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died of cancer in 1994, having lived 3 decades beyond her husband while maintaining much of the mystique that had surrounded her since the assassination. She is buried beside President Kennedy at Arlington, the eternal flame still burning between them. Caroline Kennedy, their daughter, has pursued public service in quieter ways, serving as ambassador to Japan and to Australia. John Kennedy Jr., who had saluted his father's casket as a small boy, grew into a handsome and charismatic man who seemed to carry echoes of his father. He founded a political magazine and was considering entering politics himself when he died in a plane crash in 1999, age 38. His death, in its sudden tragedy, felt like yet another blow to a family that had suffered more than its share. Of the major figures from that terrible day in Dallas, very few remain. Governor Connolly recovered from his wounds and went on to serve as Treasury Secretary under President Nixon before dying in 1993. Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent who leaped onto the back of the limousine, carried guilt for decades about not having protected the president, though by any reasonable standard he had done everything humanly possible. He eventually wrote about his experiences, helping to preserve a first-hand account of those moments. Most of the other witnesses and participants have passed away, taking their memories with them. The assassination's impact on the presidency itself has been profound and lasting. The Secret Service, determined never to allow such a tragedy to occur again, dramatically increased security measures around presidents. The days of presidents riding in open cars through city streets, accessible to crowds of well-wishers, were over. Presidents became increasingly isolated, surrounded by agents and barriers, separated from the people they served by layers of security. This was necessary, perhaps, but it also changed the nature of the office, making presidents more remote, less able to connect directly with ordinary citizens. The assassination also contributed to a broader loss of trust in government and institutions that accelerated through the rest of the 60s and into the 70s. The Warren Commission's conclusions, widely disbelieved, fed suspicions that the government was hiding something. These suspicions seemed confirmed by later revelations about government actions, from the FBI's surveillance of civil rights leaders to the CIA's involvement in foreign coups to the lies told about the Vietnam War to the crimes of Watergate. By the mid-70s, faith in government had plummeted from the relatively high levels of the early 60s. The assassination can be seen as the first crack in that faith, the beginning of an erosion that would fundamentally change the relationship between Americans and their leaders. In the realm of popular culture, the assassination has been revisited countless times. Books and films have examined it from every conceivable angle, from sober historical analyses to wild speculative fiction. Oliver Stone's 1991 film, JFK, brought the conspiracy theories to a mass audience, presenting a version of events that most historians reject but that captured the public imagination. The film was criticized for playing loose with facts and for promoting discredited theories, yet it also reignited public interest in the assassination and led to the declassification of additional government documents. This tension between historical accuracy and dramatic storytelling has characterized much of the cultural engagement with the assassination. The photographs and films from that day have become iconic, reproduced so many times that they have achieved a kind of abstract quality, divorced from the actual events they document. The Zapruder film, the images of Jackie Kennedy in her blood-stained suit, the photograph of John Jr.'s salute, have all been so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that they have become symbols as much as records. They stand for grief, for lost innocence, for the 60s, for America itself. In this way, the assassination has transcended its historical moment to become a kind of universal story about loss and change. Dealey Plaza itself remains a space of memory and controversy. On any given day, visitors can find themselves approached by conspiracy theorists offering tours, pointing out the supposed locations of additional gunmen, explaining elaborate theories about what really happened. The sixth-floor museum tries to maintain a more balanced approach, but even entering the building where Oswald fired his shots feels transgressive somehow, as if you are trespassing on sacred and terrible ground. The window itself, preserved behind plexiglass, looks down on the street where history was made, where one man's action changed everything. There have been calls over the years to move on, to stop obsessing over the assassination, to accept the official findings and focus on Kennedy's life and legacy rather than his death. These calls have largely gone unheeded. Something about the assassination seems to demand continued attention, continued questioning, continued attempts to understand. Perhaps it is because the stakes were so high, the consequences so far-reaching. Perhaps it is because the death was so public, so documented, yet in some ways so mysterious. Perhaps it is simply that for those who live through it, the wound has never fully healed, and each new generation encounters the story and finds in it something that speaks to their own concerns and fears. In recent years, as the generation that remembers the assassination has aged and diminished, there has been a question about whether the Kennedy presidency and its violent end will retain their hold on the American imagination. To younger people, Kennedy is a figure from history books, not a living memory. The 1960s, which seemed so recent to those who lived through them, are now as far in the past as the 1920s were to people in the 60s. The cultural references, the assumptions, the context that made Kennedy's presidency meaningful, have all receded into history. Yet there are signs that interest persists. New books about Kennedy and the assassination continue to appear regularly, finding audiences. Documentaries revisit the evidence with modern forensic techniques. The Sixth Floor Museum remains a popular tourist destination. Young people discover the Zapruder film online and are shocked by its graphic reality, so different from the sanitized violence of movies and video games. There seems to be something in the story that transcends generational change, something that continues to resonate. Perhaps it is the fundamental story of mortality, of the fact that anyone, even the most powerful person in the world, can be struck down in an instant. Kennedy seemed to have everything: youth, health, beauty, power, a beautiful wife and family, the adoration of millions. Yet none of it could protect him from a mail-order rifle in the hands of a troubled young man. It is a stark reminder of human vulnerability, of the fragility of life, of the fact that our plans and ambitions can be ended without warning. Or perhaps it is the story of lost potential, of what might have been. Kennedy's presidency, for all its limitations, represented a moment of idealism and hope that seems rare in our more cynical age. His vision of America as a force for good in the world, of service as a noble calling, of the future as something that could be shaped through courage and intelligence, was inspiring even if not fully realized. His death seemed to close off possibilities, to darken the future in ways that could not have been imagined before Dallas. The question of what would have happened if Kennedy had lived is, of course, unanswerable, but that has not stopped people from speculating. Would he have escalated American involvement in Vietnam or found a way to avoid the quagmire that destroyed Lyndon Johnson's presidency? Would he have been able to pass civil rights legislation, or would he have continued to move cautiously, alienating activists without appeasing conservatives? Would he have been re-elected in 1964, or might he have been defeated by Barry Goldwater or another Republican challenger? Would his personal scandals have emerged during his lifetime, or would they have remained hidden by a compliant press? Would his health have held up under the demands of a second term? Would he have grown as a president, becoming the transformative figure his admirers claim he would have been, or would he have proven disappointing, another politician unable to deliver on his promises? These questions have no answers, but asking them is a way of engaging with the might-have-beens of history, with the paths not taken. Kennedy's death created a fork in the road, sending American history in one direction when it might have gone in another. We can never know what would have happened on that alternate path, but we can imagine, and perhaps in imagining, we reveal something about our own hopes and fears, our own sense of what matters. What we do know is what happened after Dallas. We know that Lyndon Johnson, for all his considerable skills as a legislative tactician, was never able to escape the shadow of his predecessor or to win the full confidence of the American people. We know that the Vietnam War expanded into a catastrophe that killed tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, that divided the country more bitterly than anything since the Civil War, that destroyed Johnson's presidency and consumed national resources and attention for years. We know that the civil rights movement achieved great legislative victories but also faced violent resistance and eventually fractured over questions of tactics and goals. We know that assassinations became almost commonplace, with Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy joining John Kennedy in the roster of murdered leaders. We know that the optimism and idealism of the early 60s gave way to the rage and disillusionment of the late 60s and early 70s. Would any of this have been different if Kennedy had lived? Some of it, surely, though how much is impossible to say. The forces driving these events were larger than any individual, rooted in deep currents of American history and global politics. But presidents matter, and Kennedy's particular combination of qualities, his skills and limitations, his vision and blind spots, might have shaped events differently than Johnson's very different approach did. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the 60s would have turned violent and disillusioning regardless of who sat in the Oval Office. But we will never know, and that uncertainty is part of the assassination's enduring fascination. For those who were children in 1963, the assassination was often their first encounter with the fact that terrible things can happen, that the world is not entirely safe, that even presidents can die. Many of them remember being sent home from school early, remember their parents' tears, remember the funeral on television. These memories, even decades later, retain a vividness that suggests how deeply the event impressed itself on young minds. Some would later say that the assassination was when they lost their innocence, when they first understood that the adult world was not as secure as they had believed. And for those who were adults, the assassination forced a reckoning with mortality and vulnerability that was profoundly unsettling. If the president could be killed in broad daylight in an American city, what safety was there for anyone? The randomness of it was particularly disturbing. Kennedy had not been killed in war or because of some calculated attack by a foreign power. He had been killed by a nobody, a man with no real grievance against him personally, a man whose motives remained obscure even after extensive investigation. It suggested that violence could come from anywhere, that danger was not something that could be predicted or defended against with absolute certainty. In the international arena, the assassination sent shockwaves around the world. Kennedy had been a known quantity to foreign leaders, a man they had dealt with and could understand. His death and replacement by Johnson introduced uncertainty into international relations at a time when the Cold War remained tense and dangerous. The Soviet Union, in particular, worried about whether Johnson would maintain Kennedy's approach to arms control and détente, or whether the new president might prove more hawkish. Similar concerns were felt in capitals around the world, as leaders tried to understand what the change in American leadership might mean for their own country's relationships with the United States. The funeral itself became a moment of global significance, with world leaders gathering in Washington in an unprecedented show of respect. Presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, came to honor the fallen American leader. The sight of such figures walking together through the streets of Washington behind Kennedy's casket was remarkable, a demonstration of how much the presidency of the United States mattered to the world, and perhaps also of genuine respect and affection for Kennedy personally. For many foreign leaders, particularly those from emerging nations, Kennedy had represented hope for a more enlightened American foreign policy, less dominated by Cold War rigidity and more open to the aspirations of the developing world. His death was mourned far beyond America's borders. In the Soviet Union, despite the official hostility between the two superpowers, there was genuine sadness at Kennedy's death. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had faced off against Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was reportedly deeply affected by the news. The two leaders had developed a grudging respect for each other, and there was a sense that they had been moving toward a more stable relationship after the near disaster in Cuba. Khrushchev attended a memorial service at the American Embassy in Moscow, and Soviet television broadcast coverage of the funeral, unusual for a time when Western news was typically suppressed. The Soviet leader wrote to Jacqueline Kennedy expressing his condolences, and years later would speak warmly of the slain president in his memoirs. The assassination also had implications for how presidents would be protected in the future. The Secret Service, which had been established primarily to combat counterfeiting and had only gradually taken on the role of protecting presidents, was transformed after Dallas. Its budget and personnel were dramatically increased. New protocols were established for presidential travel. The presidential limousine was redesigned with armor plating and bulletproof glass. Future presidents would find their movements more restricted, their contact with the public more controlled and mediated. the balance between accessibility and security shifted decisively toward security, perhaps necessarily, but with a cost to the democratic idea of leaders who were of the people and accessible to them. There were also changes in how presidential assassinations were investigated and how information about them was handled. The confusion and competition between different agencies in the hours and days after the assassination, with the Dallas police, the FBI, and other agencies all trying to assert jurisdiction and control information, highlighted the need for clearer protocols. The release of information to the press, which had been haphazard and sometimes contradictory, was also recognized as needing better management. These lessons would be applied in future crises, though not always successfully. The assassination also raised questions about political violence in America more broadly. The United States had always had a streak of violence in its politics, from duels between founding fathers to mob attacks on abolitionists to assassinations of presidents and other leaders. Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley had all been killed in office, and there had been numerous attempts on other presidents. Yet there had been a sense in the mid-20th century that perhaps the country had outgrown such violence, that it had become more civilized and stable. Kennedy's assassination, followed by the murders of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy, shattered that complacency. It forced recognition that political violence remained a feature of American life, that the passions aroused by politics could still lead to murder. This recognition led to increased security for all major political figures and also to soul-searching about the culture of violence in America. Why did disagreements over policy so often turn violent? What was it about American society that produced assassins? Were guns too readily available? Was the rhetoric of politics too heated, creating an atmosphere where violence seemed justified? Was there inadequate attention to mental health, allowing troubled individuals to slip through the cracks until they acted out violently? These questions were asked after Kennedy's assassination and would be asked again after subsequent acts of political violence, but answers and solutions have proven elusive. The assassination also became a touchstone for understanding historical change and generational divides. The killing marked such a clear before and after moment that it became natural to periodize history around it. The optimism and innocence of the post-war years, the sense that America was triumphant and right, seemed to belong to the before. The skepticism, division, and turmoil that characterized the late 60s and beyond belonged to the after. Whether the assassination caused this shift or merely coincided with it is debatable, but its symbolic power as a dividing line was undeniable. For artists and writers, the assassination provided material for countless works attempting to process and understand what had happened. Norman Mailer, Don DeLillo, Stephen King, and many others wrote novels that dealt with the assassination directly or used it as a backdrop. Filmmakers from Emile d'Antonio to Oliver Stone to Peter Landesman created documentaries and dramas exploring different aspects of the event. Musicians wrote songs memorializing Kennedy or reflecting on the assassination's meaning. Some of these works were reverential, others critical, still others simply used the event as a way to explore larger themes about violence, power, and American identity. The photographs from that day have been endlessly analyzed and reinterpreted. The Zapruder film, in particular, has been treated as a kind of modern-day Shroud of Turin, examined frame by frame for clues about what really happened. Enhancements and computer analyses have been applied to try to extract every bit of information from the fuzzy images. The other photographs, too, have taken on lives of their own. The image of Jackie Kennedy reaching back over the trunk of the limousine, of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in with her beside him, of John Jr. S. salute, of the flag-draped casket on the caisson, have all become iconic, reproduced and referenced so often that they have become part of our collective visual vocabulary. As we move further from 1963, the question of what the assassination means evolves. For the generation that experienced it, it remains a defining moment, a tragedy that shaped their understanding of the world. For their children and grandchildren, it is history, important but increasingly distant. The context that made Kennedy's presidency significant, the Cold War tensions and civil rights struggles and cultural assumptions of the early 60s, requires explanation now rather than being simply understood. Kennedy himself becomes more of a historical figure and less of a living memory, and this changes how he is perceived and what lessons are drawn from his life and death. Yet certain things remain constant. The shock that violence can intrude into ordinary life, ending a leader's tenure and a nation's trajectory in seconds. The grief of sudden loss, the way an entire country can mourn collectively. The questions about what might have been, about roads not taken, about how different things could have been with different choices or different luck. These are eternal human concerns, and they give the story of Kennedy's assassination a resonance that transcends its specific historical moment. There is also something particularly American about the story. The combination of democratic openness and vulnerability, the president riding in an open car so the people could see him, made the assassination possible. The frontier mythology of violence solving problems, the ease of obtaining weapons, the culture that celebrates individualism to the point of tolerating dangerous eccentricity, all contributed to the conditions that allowed Oswald to act. The media saturation, the television coverage that brought the tragedy into every American home in real time, was a product of the technology and communications infrastructure that America had pioneered. The conspiracy theories that followed reflect a particularly American combination of skepticism toward authority and faith in the ability of individuals to uncover hidden truths. In many ways, the assassination and its aftermath are deeply embedded in American character and culture. As evening settles over our journey through this painful chapter of history, we come to understand that November 22, 1963, was not simply the day a president died. It was the day when a certain kind of faith died too, when the belief that America was somehow exempt from the darker currents of history was revealed as naive. It was the day when the future, which had seemed so bright and full of promise, suddenly became uncertain and shadowed. It was the day when violence demonstrated once again its power to reshape the world in an instant, regardless of plans or hopes or the will of millions. John Kennedy lies in Arlington National Cemetery still, the eternal flame marking his grave visible from miles away on a clear night. Jacqueline Kennedy rests beside him, reunited in death with the husband she lost so violently. Their children, Caroline and John Jr., visited the grave regularly while they lived, paying respects to a father that John could barely remember and that Caroline knew only for her first 5 years. And countless other visitors have come over the decades, standing before the simple white markers, contemplating the life and death of a president, thinking their own thoughts about mortality and legacy and the fragility of all human ambitions. The flame burns on, as Mrs. Kennedy intended, a symbol that endures even as the living memory of the events it commemorates gradually fades. In time, perhaps, the assassination will lose some of its emotional power, becoming simply one more historical event among many, studied by scholars but no longer felt in the gut by ordinary people. But that time has not yet come. For now, the story of what happened in Dallas remains vivid and painful, a wound that has scabbed over but never fully healed. And perhaps it should not fully heal. Perhaps some events are so significant that they should be remembered with the rawness of fresh grief, so that the lessons they teach are not forgotten. The assassination reminds us that democracy is fragile, that violence can upend the most careful plans, that the future is never guaranteed, that leaders are mortal, and that a single individual, for reasons good or ill, can change the course of history. These are lessons worth remembering, painful though they may be. As we close this long meditation on that November day, let us remember not just the tragedy but the grace with which it was faced. Jacqueline Kennedy's dignity in the face of unimaginable horror. Lyndon Johnson's assumption of responsibility in the midst of chaos. The crowds who lined the streets and filed past the casket, ordinary Americans trying to process their grief and pay their respects. The world leaders who came to Washington to honor a fallen colleague. the journalists who struggled to report events that seemed beyond words, the Secret Service agents who failed to protect their president but who performed their duties with courage nonetheless, the doctors who tried desperately to save a life that was already lost. All of these people, caught up in events beyond their control, responded as best they could with the resources they had. And let us remember John Kennedy himself, not as a saint or a martyr but as a man, flawed and complex like all of us, who rose to the highest office in the land and tried to use that position to move the country forward. His successes were real, if sometimes overstated. His failures were real too, if sometimes overlooked in the aftermath of his death. He was, in the end, a human being trying to navigate impossible challenges with imperfect wisdom and limited time. That his time was cut short makes his story tragic. That he faced his challenges with courage and eloquence makes his story inspiring. That we continue to debate his legacy and the circumstances of his death shows how deeply his presidency and its violent end affected the nation. The sun has set on Dallas and Washington and all the places that figured in this story. The people who lived through those days are mostly gone now, joining Kennedy in that realm beyond memory where the dead reside. But the story remains, passed down through generations, examined and re-examined, questioned and debated, felt and remembered. It remains because it touches something essential about the human experience, our vulnerability, our capacity for both terrible violence and profound grief, our need to find meaning in tragedy, our struggle to understand how one day can change everything. The story remains because it speaks to our deepest fears and our most cherished hopes. We fear sudden loss, the intrusion of chaos into order, the discovery that the structures we rely on for safety and stability are more fragile than we believed. Yet we also hope that leaders can inspire us to be better than we are, that idealism is not foolish, that one person's vision can lift an entire nation towards something greater. Kennedy embodied that hope for many, and his death seemed to kill the hope along with the men. But hope, it turns out, is more resilient than we sometimes think. It can survive even the worst tragedies, emerging wounded but alive, ready to be invested in new leaders, new movements, new possibilities. In the decades since that November day, America has faced many other challenges and tragedies. Wars and scandals, economic crises and natural disasters, social upheavals and political divisions have all tested the nation's resilience. Through it all, the memory of Kennedy's assassination has remained as a kind of reference point, a reminder of how quickly things can change, how precious stability is, how important it is to resolve our differences through peaceful means rather than violence. When political rhetoric becomes too heated, when divisions seem insurmountable, when another act of violence shocks the nation, people often think back to Dallas and remember what was lost there. The younger generation, those who have no memory of Kennedy or the 60s, might wonder what all the fuss is about. They live in a different world, one shaped by different events and different concerns. For them, the September 11th attacks might hold the same kind of defining significance that the Kennedy assassination held for their grandparents. The specific events are different, but the pattern is similar, a moment of sudden violence that shatters assumptions about safety and normalcy, that divides time into before and after, that leaves a wound on the national psyche that never quite heals. Yet there is something about Kennedy's assassination that seems to retain its power even for those who did not experience it firsthand. Perhaps it is the visual record, the Zapruder film and the photographs that capture the event with such terrible clarity. Perhaps it is the questions that remain unanswered, the conspiracy theories that suggest hidden forces at work. Perhaps it is simply the story itself, with its elements of youthful promise cut short, of a beautiful widow's dignity, of a small boy's salute, of a nation united in grief. Good stories endure, and tragic stories perhaps most of all. The physical artifacts of that day have been preserved with great care. The presidential limousine was rebuilt and continued in service for years before being retired to the Henry Ford Museum. The rifle Oswald used is stored in the National Archives. The pink suit Jacqueline Kennedy wore, still stained with her husband's blood, is preserved at the National Archives as well, though it is sealed from public view until at least 2038, in accordance with her family's wishes. These objects are relics now, tangible connections to events that live in memory and history. They have the power to make the past feel immediate and real in a way that words alone cannot. The places, too, have been preserved or at least remembered. Dealey Plaza looks much as it did in 1963, with the grassy knoll and the underpass and the Texas School Book Depository all still standing. Visitors can walk the route of the motorcade, can look up at the 6th floor window, can try to imagine what it was like to be there on that day. Arlington Cemetery, with Kennedy's grave and its eternal flame, receives millions of visitors each year. Parkland Hospital's Trauma Room 1 has been preserved as it was, though it is not open to public viewing. These places serve as sites of pilgrimage and reflection, spaces where the past and present intersect. The question of memory itself becomes important as time passes. How do we remember events we did not personally witness? How do succeeding generations understand historical moments that shaped their world but occurred before they were born? The Kennedy assassination offers a case study in collective memory, in how a nation remembers and commemorates and argues about its past. The memory has been shaped by many forces. By the immediate media coverage, by the investigations and reports, by the conspiracy theories and debunkings, by the films and books and documentaries, by the testimonies of witnesses and participants, by the reflections of historians and journalists. And the memory continues to evolve. New evidence occasionally emerges, though it rarely settles old debates and often generates new ones. Witnesses come forward with additional details, though their recollections may be colored by time and exposure to other accounts. Historians reinterpret events in light of new frameworks for understanding the past. Each generation asks different questions of the evidence, seeking answers to concerns that reflect their own time rather than the 1960s. Some have argued that the ongoing fascination with the assassination is unhealthy, that it represents an inability to move on, a kind of national obsession with tragedy that prevents us from focusing on the future. There may be some truth to this. The assassination can overshadow Kennedy's actual accomplishments and policies, reducing his presidency to its violent end rather than what came before. The conspiracy theories, in particular, can become a rabbit hole that leads away from productive engagement with real issues. The tendency to romanticize Kennedy and his era, to see the early 60s as a lost golden age, can distort our understanding of that time and our own. Yet the counterargument is equally compelling. Forgetting or minimizing significant events from our past impoverishes our understanding of how we got to where we are. The assassination was genuinely important, genuinely consequential, and pretending otherwise would be a form of historical amnesia. The questions it raises about violence and leadership and the fragility of democracy remain relevant. The emotional power of the story, far from being something to overcome, is part of what makes history feel real and important rather than just a dry recitation of facts. As we think about Kennedy's legacy beyond his death, we must acknowledge both what he achieved and what he did not. His presidency, cut short after only 1,000 days, did not have time to fully mature or to complete the agenda he had set forth. The major legislative achievements he proposed, including comprehensive civil rights legislation and Medicare, would be enacted by his successor, but Kennedy had laid the groundwork for them. His vision of America as a force for progress and freedom in the world, whatever the contradictions between rhetoric and practice, inspired a generation to see public service as a worthy calling. The Peace Corps, the space program, the moves toward arms control, all represented real accomplishments. But he also escalated American involvement in Vietnam, setting the stage for the disaster that would follow. His administration approved covert operations against Cuba and other nations that contradicted American ideals. His personal behavior, however well hidden at the time, reflected a sense of entitlement and lack of respect for his marriage vows that sits uncomfortably with the idealistic image. His caution on civil rights, while politically understandable, allowed injustice to continue when more forceful action might have brought change more quickly. He was, in short, a man of his time, sharing its prejudices and blind spots along with its aspirations. To acknowledge these complexities is not to diminish Kennedy or to suggest that his presidency was unimportant. Rather, it is to see him as a fully human figure rather than a symbol or an icon. The real John Kennedy, with all his strengths and weaknesses, is more interesting and perhaps more instructive than the mythical figure that emerged after his death. His struggles with chronic pain and illness, which he never publicly acknowledged, make his accomplishments more impressive rather than less. His personal failings remind us that great leaders are still flawed human beings. His mix of idealism and pragmatism, of eloquent vision and sometimes cynical practice, reflects the tensions inherent in democratic politics. The impact of the assassination on his family cannot be overlooked either. Jacqueline Kennedy lived another 30 years, but those years were overshadowed by the terrible day in Dallas. She remarried, seeking privacy and distance from the Kennedy legacy, but she could never entirely escape the role history had thrust upon her. Her later years as a book editor in New York suggested a desire for a quieter, more normal existence, but she remained a public figure, her past always present. Caroline Kennedy, who was just 5 when her father died, grew up with the weight of that loss and that legacy. She has generally avoided the spotlight, though she has served her country in various ways, including as ambassador to Japan. The choice to live a more private life than other Kennedys, while still maintaining a commitment to public service, suggests a careful balance between honoring her father's memory and establishing her own identity. John Kennedy Jr.'s life and death became their own tragedy within the larger tragedy. He grew up as the son America watched salute his father's casket, carrying a burden of expectation and public interest that would have been difficult for anyone. His good looks and charisma invited comparisons to his father, and there was constant speculation about whether he would enter politics. His death in a plane crash in 1999, just as he seemed to be finding his own path, felt to many like a cruel echo of his father's sudden death. That both men died young, both in their prime, both leaving behind questions about what they might have accomplished, created a kind of symmetry that seemed almost mythological in its pattern. Robert Kennedy's children also carried the weight of 2 assassinations, their fathers and their uncles. Some, like Robert Kennedy Jr., became prominent public figures. Others chose more private paths. All had to navigate the legacy of being Kennedys, with all the privilege and burden that entailed. The family remained in public life, with various members serving in Congress and other positions, but the toll of the tragedies was evident. Substance abuse, mental health struggles, and other difficulties plagued various family members, suggesting that the weight of history and expectation was sometimes too much to bear. Edward Kennedy, Ted, was the last surviving brother, and he carried that survival with a mixture of dedication and guilt. He became the guardian of his brother's legacies while trying to establish his own. His presidential ambitions were undone by the Chappaquiddick incident in 1969, when a young woman died after the car he was driving went off a bridge, and his behavior afterward raised serious questions about his character and judgment. He remained in the Senate, however, and became one of the most effective legislators of his era, championing causes his brothers had supported and working to fulfill the promise of their truncated careers. When Ted Kennedy died in 2009, after serving nearly 47 years in the Senate, it marked the end of an era. He was the last of the Kennedy brothers, the last direct connection to the generation of leaders who had shaped the 1960s. His death closed a chapter that had opened with such hope nearly half a century earlier and had been marked by tragedy after tragedy. The torch he had spoken of in his eulogy for his brother Robert, the torch that had been passed to a new generation, had finally been passed again to others who would have to find their own way without the Kennedy brothers to guide or inspire them. The political landscape that emerged after the Kennedy assassination was fundamentally different from what had come before. The consensus that had characterized the 1950s and early 60s, the sense that there was broad agreement on America's direction even if there were disagreements on specifics, broke down. The Vietnam War shattered any remaining unity, dividing the nation between hawks and doves, between those who believed in the domino theory and those who saw the war as immoral imperialism. The civil rights movement, achieving legislative victories but facing continued resistance and violence, split along lines of tactics and philosophy. The counterculture emerged, challenging traditional values and authority in ways that alarmed older Americans. Whether these developments would have occurred anyway, or whether Kennedy's leadership might have channeled them differently, is impossible to know. Johnson's Great Society programs achieved much of what Kennedy had proposed, but Johnson lacked Kennedy's ability to inspire and unite. His escalation of the Vietnam War, which he claimed was consistent with Kennedy's policies, destroyed his presidency and his reputation. Nixon's election in 1968 brought a more conservative approach that reversed or stalled many of the programs of the 60s. The trajectory of American politics from the optimistic liberalism of the early 60s to the conservative ascendancy that began in the 80s was shaped by many factors, but the assassination was certainly one of them. The assassination also affected how Americans viewed their own history and mythology. The frontier mythology that had shaped American self-understanding, the sense that America was always moving forward, always progressing, always improving, was challenged by the reality that progress could be reversed, that violence was endemic rather than exceptional, that the future was not guaranteed to be better than the past. The American exceptionalism that held that the United States was special, blessed, exempt from the tragedies that afflicted other nations, was revealed as hubris. America was not immune to political violence, to demagoguery, to the darker currents of human nature. The assassination was a kind of fall from innocence, a recognition of mortality not just for one president but for the national myth itself. Yet even as the old mythologies were challenged, new ones emerged. The Kennedy myth, Camelot, offered its own form of American exceptionalism, the idea that there had been a brief shining moment of grace and idealism, that it had been destroyed by dark forces, but that it might someday be recovered or recreated. This myth was perhaps as misleading as the older ones, romanticizing a presidency that was in reality more complex and conflicted. But myths serve psychological and cultural functions beyond their historical accuracy. They provide narratives through which people make sense of their experiences. They offer ideals to aspire to even if those ideals are not entirely realistic. The question of truth becomes particularly fraught when dealing with the assassination. What really happened? Was it as simple as the Warren Commission concluded, or was there a conspiracy? If there was a conspiracy, who was behind it and why? These questions have been debated for 6 decades without reaching consensus. The evidence has been examined and re-examined countless times. Every witness statement has been analyzed, every photograph enhanced, every document scrutinized. Yet certainty remains elusive. Part of the problem is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The failure to find definitive proof of a conspiracy does not prove there was no conspiracy, only that if there was one, it was well concealed. This creates an epistemological puzzle. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that something did not happen when the lack of evidence for it might simply mean it was hidden successfully? For those inclined to believe in conspiracy, no amount of evidence to the contrary is sufficient, because that evidence itself might be part of the cover-up. This is not to say that all conspiracy theories are equally credible or that skepticism about official accounts is always justified. Many of the theories that have been proposed about the assassination are demonstrably false, based on misunderstandings of evidence or outright fabrications. The Warren Commission's conclusions, while not perfect, are based on substantial evidence and have been supported by subsequent investigations. The most likely explanation remains that Oswald acted alone, motivated by a complex mix of political ideology, personal grievance, and desire for significance. But the certainty that this explanation should command is undermined by the irregularities in the investigation, the premature killing of Oswald, and the long history of government deception about other matters. In the end, perhaps what matters most is not whether we can definitively answer every question about the assassination, but whether we can learn from it. The lessons are numerous and important. About the need for better protection of political leaders. About the dangers of political polarization and heated rhetoric. About the importance of mental health care and recognizing warning signs before troubled individuals turn violent. About the fragility of democracy and the need for robust institutions that can survive the loss of individual leaders. About the importance of honest investigation and transparent government. About the need to balance security with democratic values and accessibility. About the human cost of violence and the ripples that spread from a single act. These lessons have not always been learned or applied consistently. Political rhetoric remains often heated and sometimes crosses into incitement. Gun violence continues to plague America, with presidents and other leaders still occasionally targeted. Conspiracy theories flourish in an age of social media and fractured information systems. Trust in government continues to decline. The tensions between security and democracy remain unresolved, with leaders increasingly isolated from the people they serve while privacy and civil liberties are increasingly eroded in the name of safety. Yet there have been positive changes as well. The Secret Service, for all its occasional failures, has prevented numerous assassination attempts. The investigative procedures following political violence have improved. There is greater awareness of the warning signs that precede violent acts, even if that awareness is not always translated into effective intervention. The public discourse, while often contentious, has occasionally shown restraint and recognition of the dangers of inflammatory language. Progress has been uneven and incomplete, but it has occurred. As evening deepens into night and our journey through this painful history approaches its end, let us take one more moment to remember what was lost on November 22, 1963, and what endured. A president died, struck down in his prime, his potential unfulfilled. A wife lost her husband in the most traumatic circumstances imaginable. Children lost their father. A nation lost its leader and a certain kind of innocence. The future that might have been was closed off, replaced by a different timeline with its own tragedies and triumphs. But other things survived and grew from the ashes of that terrible day. The ideals Kennedy articulated, the call to service and sacrifice, continued to inspire people long after his death. The programs he initiated, from the Peace Corps to the space program, carried forward his vision. The civil rights movement, which he had supported cautiously and belatedly, achieved the victories he had helped make possible. The arms control efforts he began led eventually to treaties that reduced the danger of nuclear war. His example of courage in facing adversity, both political and personal, remained a model for others. And perhaps most importantly, the nation itself survived. The peaceful transition of power, accomplished on Air Force One just hours after the assassination, demonstrated that American democracy was stronger than any individual, that institutions could endure even when leaders fell. The government continued to function, laws continued to be passed, the business of the nation continued despite the shock and grief. This was not insignificant. In many countries, the violent death of a leader would have led to chaos, coups, civil war. That America avoided such outcomes, that it mourned collectively and then moved forward, spoke to the strength of its democratic foundations. The eternal flame at Arlington burns on through all the seasons, through summer heat and winter cold, through the decades that have passed since Jacqueline Kennedy first lit it. It burns for the man who was president, yes, but perhaps also for something larger, for idealism and hope, for the belief that leadership matters and that individual courage can make a difference, for the recognition that even in tragedy there can be dignity and grace. It burns as a reminder of what was and what might have been, but also as a symbol of continuity, of memory refusing to fade, of a story that continues to matter. The people who lived through November 1963 are old now, in their 70s and 80s and beyond, their numbers diminishing with each passing year. Soon there will be no one left with living memory of that day, no one who can say, "I was there," or "I remember where I was when I heard the news." The assassination will pass from living memory into history, joining all the other events that we know about only through documents and recordings, through second-hand accounts and scholarly analysis. This transition is inevitable and in some ways freeing, allowing us to see events more clearly without the distortions of emotion and personal investment. But something will be lost too in that transition. The visceral reality of the event, the way it felt to live through it, the texture of the emotions it evoked, will become harder to access. The assassination will become more like the assassinations of Lincoln or Garfield, events we know about intellectually but cannot feel in our bones. Future generations will study what happened in Dallas with the same detachment they bring to studying ancient Rome or medieval Europe. The passion and controversy that have surrounded the assassination will seem quaint, artifacts of a different time when people cared deeply about events that have faded into the historical record. Yet stories have a way of surviving even when memory fades. The story of John Kennedy, of his rise and his death, has elements that transcend any particular time period. Ambition and idealism, courage and frailty, hope and tragedy, are eternal human themes. The young leader struck down before his time, the grieving widow's dignity, the small boy's salute, the nation's mourning, these are archetypal images that speak across generations. The story will be retold, reshaped, reinterpreted by each generation that encounters it, and in that retelling it will remain alive even when the last witnesses have passed away. And so we come to the end of our long night's journey through this chapter of history. We have walked the streets of Dallas, stood in the corridors of Parkland Hospital, followed the funeral procession through Washington, watched the flame being lit at Arlington. We have tried to understand what happened and why, what it meant and what it changed. We have contemplated the life that was ended and the lives that were forever altered. We have sat with the grief and the questions, the certainties and the mysteries. The sun will rise again tomorrow, as it has risen every day since November 22, 1963. Life continues, as it must. New challenges arise, new leaders emerge, new crises demand attention. The world moves forward, and the events of the past recede gradually into history. But the past is not entirely past. It shapes us in ways we often do not recognize, influences our choices and perspectives, haunts us with its might-have-beens and what-ifs. John Kennedy is gone, his body resting beneath a simple white marker on a Virginia hillside, but his story endures. It endures in the memories of those who knew him and those who only knew of him. It endures in the policies he initiated and the changes he helped bring about. It endures in the questions that remain unanswered and the debates that continue. It endures in the ideal of leadership he represented, however imperfectly he embodied it. It endures in the reminder that time is precious, that leadership is difficult, that violence can undo in seconds what takes years to build, that we are all mortal and our time is limited. As the flame flickers in the darkness at Arlington, as another day ends and another begins, we can take with us the lessons of that November day so long ago. We can remember that democracy is fragile and must be protected. That leaders are human and deserve both our critical scrutiny and our compassion. That violence solves nothing and destroys much. That grief is universal and healing is slow. That hope can survive even the worst tragedies. That we are all connected, citizens of the same nation, members of the same human family, sharing a common fate on this small planet spinning through space. Rest now, traveler. Let these thoughts settle into your mind as sleep approaches. The story has been told, the history recounted, the memories honored. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns and challenges, but tonight we have paused to remember, to reflect, to feel the weight of history and the persistence of memory. In remembering what was lost on that day in Dallas, perhaps we can better appreciate what we have, better guard what we cherish, better understand our responsibility to each other and to the future. The eternal flame burns on through the night, a small light against the darkness, a symbol of remembrance and hope. And we who have listened to this long tale of tragedy and dignity, of violence and grace, can carry forward our own small lights, our own commitments to making the world a little better, a little kinder, a little more worthy of the ideals that leaders like Kennedy articulated, even if they could not always live up to them themselves. Sleep well, dear traveler. May your dreams be gentle, may your rest be peaceful, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the preciousness of life, the importance of each moment, the value of striving toward ideals even when we fall short. The past has been honored in our telling and our listening. Now we release it back into the stream of time, where it flows ever onward, shaping the present and future in ways we can glimpse but never fully know. The story of November 22nd, 1963, is ended for tonight. The flame burns on. Memory endures. Life continues. And in the silence that follows these words, in the space between waking and sleeping, perhaps we find a moment of peace, a breath of understanding, a sense of connection to all who have lived through tragedy and carried forward despite their grief. We are part of that long human story, that endless chain of generations passing the torch, carrying the light, trying as best we can to leave the world a little better than we found it. Good night, traveler. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through memory and history. Until we meet again in another tale from the past, rest well, dream gently, and know that you are part of the great story of humanity, with all its tragedies and triumphs, its darkness and its light. The night is kind, and morning will come, as it always does, bringing with it new possibilities and new hope. Sleep now, and may the peace that John Kennedy sought for the world find its way into your heart tonight.